People who have been clinically dead. What did you experience in death, if anything? My wife and I discussed this at length. 4 years ago, she died twice in 3 months, needing full resuscitation both times. Both were lengthy rescues. One resuscitation was off and on for nearly 40 minutes. I asked her later when she had recovered if she remembered anything at all during the times she was clinically dead. She remembered nothing. Blackness. No light, no relatives and former pets waiting for her, just black. Thankfully, also no pain. She finally passed 18 months ago, and I hope she felt no pain or worry the final time as well. Edit. It started with 2 spontaneous brain bleeds. Technically, it started with her having lupus. The first brain bleed led to her passing, but they did a craniotomy, revived her, and then a rebleed. The trauma from all that caused her lupus to set fire, which led to complete kidney failure and another cardiac arrest, passing and recovery, which led to 2 strokes. She recovered enough to be home and mostly independent, but having to go to dialysis 3 times a week for 3 years. She passed the final test to get on the kidney transplant list on Wednesday, and had a massive cardiac/respiratory event at dialysis on Friday where she passed again, but was kept alive on life support. I waited a week hoping for recovery, but we disconnected life support per her wishes, a topic we had talked about many times. Story 2. When I was 15, I was scheduled to do a tilt table test. They lean you up at an angle on a table, because I was consistently experiencing dizziness and fainting spells. After about 20 minutes, the doctor tilted the table back and I could feel myself passing out. I got severe tunnel vision and lost about 95% of my eyesight, like looking through a straw, and then I blacked out. I remember hearing the doctor call the code and my father cussing at the doctor that he ended me. I remember hearing a lot of slamming and banging around, which I assumed was the crash cart and nurses shoving into this small testing room. I felt a pressure on my chest, like when you have someone stand on your back to crack it, which I later found out was the nurses doing CPR. I saw an array of vivid colors kind of dancing around, forming objects in the dark. The scariest thing was how peaceful it felt. Just pure 100% peace. No panic, no pain, no sadness, nothing. Just bliss. I coded for just under 2 minutes, and as soon as I came to and opened my eyes, I felt seriously angry and hostile. I started ripping off whatever I could get my hands on and yelling at the doctor to get me off the table. I mean, hey, I'd be mad too if I got awoken from the best sleep of my life. Seriously though, the idea of feeling absolute bliss as you're passing is really horrifying, actually. Like, there's a weird part of me that wants there to be some really dramatic fear in me, like, oh my gosh, this is it, you know? But if it's just peaceful, maybe it just feels anticlimactic. Maybe I'm just a drama queen. Story 3. Not mine, but the head of my program was in a horrible car accident. She was dead for a few minutes on the scene while paramedics worked on her. She said it was the most amazing feeling she's ever experienced. It was blank, black, nothing. But that was perfectly fine. She felt a comfort that she can't even explain. She remembers being angry at the men working on her when she finally came to her body because she wanted to stay there. She told us she can't wait to experience it again when it's really her turn. Edit. I'm really pleased this resonated so strongly with many of you. I wanted to add some detail about her. She's not religious in the slightest, and she actively quashes our ghost stories and crap, mortuary students, because she only believes in tangible things. So she fully turned me into a believer. Felt it's important I make a distinction. She was very adamant when telling us this story. She's not advocating to take your own life. She stressed that she isn't telling us she's trying to reach this place again, but that when it is her time to go, she will be comfortable embracing it. Story 4. I was electrocuted by about 13,800 volts. The doctors say it's likely the first hit stopped my heart and the second one started it, before I was pulled like a lifeless corpse to safety. I remember experiencing the darkest dark and the most silent silence. I ceased to care that I was dying. Time seemed to change. It could have been hours. It was really only about 30 seconds, though. I felt as though I was floating and floated towards something that I eventually realized was my body and reality. Upon joining with whatever it was I was floating towards, I became self-aware in my body and heard the electricity making horrible noises and knew I was in danger. From there, it was a horribly painful experience where I lost most of my toes due to tissue death and had severe electrical burns on all 4 limbs. More surgeries than I care to count, and seeing the round bone ends of my toes that were freshly amputated still haunts me a little. Edit. Thank you, everyone, for helping me understand something that happened over 12 years ago. I was in the hospital for about a month inpatient, and then for 10 months daily as an outpatient. Basically sent me home for my mental sanity but needed daily attention. I got addicted to painkillers, had to learn to walk again, and had to see a pain management therapist. It was horrible at times, but eventually the pain began to subside. I went back to school and became an engineer, and I don't think I'd be where I am today without this thing happening. Really strange to think that I am in some way grateful now. Also, can't watch horror anymore. Hollywood actually does a very realistic job. Story 5. My girlfriend is anaphylactic, and it is triggered by a chemical called salicylate, found in pretty much every food. When she was in high school, she had her first big reaction, and the school nurses refused to administer her EpiPen adrenaline shot until the ambulance got there. Now, obviously, having an anaphylactic reaction doesn't really give you a lot of waiting time, so by the time the ambulances got to her school, she was in pretty bad shape and barely conscious. The paramedics immediately administered one of her EpiPens, called the nurses some bad names, and loaded her into the ambulance as her mother arrived. She continued to fade, so they gave her a direct injection of adrenaline this time, but still nothing. They gave her a second direct injection of adrenaline, and this time it hits her about 30 seconds later all at once. And her heart fails. She stops breathing, no pulse, nothing. Dead to the world. For about 2 minutes and 46 seconds, she was clinically dead. And the scariest thing is, she saw nothing. She tells me that when you're losing consciousness, you can't tell the difference between waves of drowsiness and when your body actually shuts down. All she saw was the darkness of her eyelids, and it felt like going into an extremely calm sleep where she couldn't hear or feel anything, and she didn't mind it. All despite the fact her mother and the paramedics were screaming at her to keep her eyes open and the ambulance was flying towards the hospital. She miraculously just came back to life almost 3 minutes later as they were giving chest compressions, and the cardiologist that assessed her later stated that all the adrenaline in her body was enough to not only stop her heart, but also restart it, with a little help from the paramedic pumping it around. But still to this day, she can't differentiate falling asleep after a long day and dying. As someone with an EpiPen, I just gotta say, these nurses suck. Whatever bad names the paramedics called them, 100% deserved. You almost ended the life of a child. Well done, idiots. Story 6. As someone who lost his younger brother 4 months ago to a psychosis-induced taking of his own life after years of painful and miserable addiction and anxiety and depression, many of these comments have given me more of a sense of peace. I hope he felt okay in his final moments and wasn't in the constant pain he felt 24/7 here and in his mind. Story 7. I was dead for a very short period of time, like 30 seconds to a minute. There's a big misconception about it. It's not like sleeping at all. I'll try to explain. There's always sort of a white noise in the back of my mind. It quiets down when I sleep, but it's still there. I never noticed it before I died, but I do now. I don't want to romanticize death, but when I was out, it was like this perfect nothingness. And nothingness is so hard to imagine normally, but once you experience it and they bring you back, part of you wishes you could have stayed. There's no positive feelings there, obviously, but it takes away everything bad, too. All your stress, the nightmares, the troubles, all gone. Just nothing exists. It's beautiful in a way. I don't have thoughts of taking my own life at all, and hope to live the rest of a long and happy life. But I'm very much looking forward to a lack of consciousness when I do eventually pass again, and I can honestly say I don't fear death anymore. Story 8. I know 3 people that have been clinically dead and have come back. What they described is something much different than what people are talking about here. They all said, if you paraphrase, that it feels like as if you're passing out. Someone compared it to ODing on nitrous oxide, a feeling of your consciousness slowly getting focused into one point in the exact middle of your head, while your limbs lose feeling in a tingling, pleasant way, and then you lose consciousness. One girl said that when she came back, she was hallucinating because she had no idea what was going on, and that she started dreaming of something safe. For example, her mother hugging her in a warm bed. Story 9. Former coworker of mine died during heart surgery. I think she was out for 90 seconds or close to it. She wasn't religious or anything. She said that she remembered being in the room and seeing her dead uncle and cousin standing at the far end of the room watching everything going on. Story 10. I saw my grandpa. We talked for a while and he said I could go back with him or stay. I looked down and saw myself in that hospital bed with my brother holding my hand. He felt it turn cold and I never saw him cry that way before. Went back into my body and felt more pain than I knew in my life. Been a year of recovery and I lost most of my memory, but I'm happy. Skull fracture / traumatic brain injury from heat exhaustion. Story 11. This happened well before my girlfriend and I got together, but she intentionally overdosed on methadone and was clinically dead briefly at the hospital. She said she could see the doctors and her husband in the room from above, and then she found herself in a meadow with her first boyfriend just talking like nothing had happened. Then she felt herself getting pulled out of there abruptly and suddenly sprang up with her eyes wide open, and she was back to life. Story 12. Not really sure what happened, and it still freaks me out to this day. My daughter was 4 and developed pneumonia. Her breathing would stop in her sleep, so we took her into the emergency room. She was there for a total of 5 days. For the first 3, her health kept deteriorating. On the 3rd day, my girlfriend got a call that her mother had collapsed and was taken to the hospital. She was without oxygen for 20 minutes and was declared brain dead. That night, my daughter woke up and asked about Grandma. No one had said anything to her or in the room with her. We asked what she meant. She told us that Grandma came to her in a dream and said, "It's not her time yet. I'll go for you." Immediately the next day, she was almost 100% better. I don't really care if this is fake or not. Something about a story like this, it just, I don't know, touches the heart in a certain way, doesn't it? And has a little bit of that beautiful mysticism with it too that just makes it, I don't know, a great story. A feel-good story in a way. Story 13. I was dead for 6 minutes. I was laying on the gurney and I was getting colder. Somewhere my body started warming up and everything became really calm and peaceful. I was no longer in pain. All the noise from the ER just went away and it was really enjoyable. I was thinking about my daughter and I was remembering all the things we had done. Slowly it was just black and nothing. There was no knowledge of anything. It was like before I was born. Then the worst thing in the world is being revived. I started hearing loud noises. I felt this massive pain. Then there was the nastiest stench ever. The smell was like every dead animal had crawled into my nose. The smell was so bad I started vomiting. I remember the doctors turning me on my side and watching my vomit spray on a nurse. Dying was the most pleasant thing I've experienced, and being revived, the worst. Story 14. Not me personally, but my grandmother, after giving birth to my uncle, was clinically dead for a bit. She told me that she felt herself rising out of her body, and she ended up in the top corner of the room with a view over her bed and the doctor. It was then she willed herself back to her body and was alive again. Edit. After looking through this thread, it seems as though this had happened to a lot of people. I always just thought she was a bit crazy, as this was the story she told for her justification for believing there's a god and afterlife. But I guess there is truth in her story. Story 15. One of my old frat brothers was clinically dead for like 40 seconds because of Xanax. He said he saw himself floating above his body in the hospital room. He said that he could see doctors and nurses working on him and family in the room. He said he slowly floated above the hospital and toward a light. He said the most peaceful feeling he has ever experienced washed over him. This is a person who has done MDMA and coke in college. He said it's almost impossible to describe the feeling with our vocabulary. He said it feels like a weight was lifted off. He said he saw some long-gone family in the light, but they told him it wasn't his time. He said he was angry because he felt so good but floated back down to his body. I have no idea if he's telling the truth, but he's a trustworthy friend. He never used drugs again. When thinking about this whole thread, really, I do wonder how much your belief about what happens when you die influences what you would experience, you know? Like, if this guy had no concept of what happens when you die, would he have experienced these same things? Because this stuff is pretty Hollywood, isn't it? You die, you sort of float out of your body, and you can see everything, and you talk to old loved ones. It's pretty, I don't know, media typical, I guess. And I wonder if having that sort of influence changed what he experienced. And hey, all the drugs he'd done in his life probably influenced it too. Story 16. I was 6 or 7 years old, and one day I got rushed to the hospital by my parents because they heard me breathing really loud and hard. The last thing I remembered were faces of the doctors and nurses above me while I was lying on my back. Then I flatlined. The weirdest, most unexplainable thing happened then and there. I suddenly could see the whole scene as a spectator, like I was a floating spirit in that room. I could see myself getting revived, saw my mom crying and my dad comforting her. Then I saw a white entity shaped like my body falling through the ceiling and slowly, like a leaf on the wind, falling down to eventually land inside my body. That's when the experience ended. I was put in a medically induced coma and I woke up after some days. I don't remember. I had a staff plugged into me, an IV, red glowing elastic ring on my finger, etc. Anyway, I later mentioned to the doctors that I saw it all. I saw them using the defibrillators, my parents, etc. No one really believed me and told me I was probably dreaming and biasing my memories due to watching TV, but I know what I saw. Story 17. Anaphylaxis. wasn't breathing. I considered all the hallucinations I experienced likely due to the hypoxic episode until I told my mom what I saw. A middle-aged man who wasn't in scrubs standing still at the end of my bed while all the staff were running around and doing their business. I was having a nonverbal conversation with him, and he was telling me to calm down, focus on breathing. He wore a tropical-style button-down shirt, as well as one of those old-school newsboys hats, and had a very pleasant demeanor. Mom showed me a photo of my grandpa that I had never seen before, and it was the guy at the foot of my bed. He died before I was even born. Edit. Didn't know this would comfort so many people. Just remember, don't worry too much about death. Remember to enjoy your life while you have it. Story 18. I was on loads of morphine, so it's still really hazy, and the fact it happened almost 6 years ago doesn't help the memory, but I'll try to recollect as accurately as I can what happened and what I experienced. I had appendicitis, and my foster parents at the time didn't take me to the hospital until 2, almost 3 days after it had burst. I should have been dead well before they took me. Even the doctors called it a miracle. Well, I died while waiting for surgery. I had to wait for a pediatric surgeon to come in because no one else felt comfortable performing the surgery on a case this bad with a child this size. Fools took me to the adult hospital, not the pediatrics, which was 40 minutes away. I was 14, 5'3", and weighed 75 pounds soaking wet. So while I was waiting for the surgeon, I was in a room with me, the doctor, my 2 foster parents, and my grandmother, who is an RN. Like I said, I was really drugged up and couldn't really focus on much and couldn't do anything. The monitor I was hooked up to would beep really loudly from time to time, and the intervals between the beeps started to decrease rapidly. Turns out, I wasn't breathing. I was conscious for the most part. I just kept forgetting to breathe. Doctors had to nudge me so I wouldn't sleep. I just remember being upset at this loud beeping that kept me from enjoying a nice slumber. The doctor had to step out for a second, and my grandmother assured him she could look after me. Unfortunately for her, she was out of her mind with rage at my foster parents. She didn't hold anything back. My grandma is a sweet Mormon from Utah without a rude bone in her body. Well, I heard quite a few FUs, pieces of crap, etc. My point is, she didn't notice I had passed out until the monitor signaled I had flatlined. This is the bit where I died, and is by far the most vivid part of the experience. I remember being capable of thought, but no thoughts were in my head. I can only describe it as being conscious of my spirit, but without a body for my thoughts to be processed in. I just kind of existed without feeling, thinking, or being anything. I was floating. Honestly, at the time, it was a great feeling. I don't remember any visions of people, family, places, or anything like that, but I felt something wrap around me and comfort me. Without talking, I was assured I was okay, that there was nothing to be worried about, and at that point my thoughts returned. I knew at that moment, without knowing how long I'd be able to keep thinking, that I had to go back. I didn't want to, but knowing that the last thing I'd see before I left mortal life was these 2 pieces of human trash who had abused me, neglected me, treated me like a stain they didn't want to bother cleaning up, that did it. I wanted to get back to my body, fix my freaking life, so I could go back and live with my biological parents and feel loved again. In that moment, that's all I cared about. And then I sort of willed myself back. Doctors had tried to resuscitate me, but failed. Everyone was shocked when I opened my eyes, and seeing the tears in my grandma's eyes after thinking she'd lost me, that did it. I fixed my life. I reinvented myself. I threw out all my anger, depression, rage, and everything else that put me into Brent and Karen's home. Honestly, the only anger I felt, the burning hatred kind that makes you want to do anything possible to release it, in the last 5-ish years since I moved from their home, is when I think about them, and how they're still fostering youth in custody and probably pulling the same crap with those kids. I live about an hour away from where they are now, and I have to restrain myself from driving up there, kidnapping those kids, and taking them to the authorities with an explanation of why. The only reason I haven't done that is because I've tried telling the authorities what kind of people they are, and I guess the words of a juvenile screw-up don't stack up against the lies from people who have practiced this crap for years. Anyway, sorry for the rant at the end. I know it wasn't entirely what you asked, but it felt good to type out. Story 19. Not necessarily clinically dead, but I was pronounced dead 2 times in the same night after a car accident I was in when I was 16. My great-grandma pulled me out of the car and we walked through this really peaceful field of flowers. When I woke up 2 weeks later, she was sitting on the edge of my bed and told me to tell my mom that everything was going to be okay. My great-grandma died when I was 10, and before that she was bedridden after a stroke. I never saw her walk or heard her talk in my entire life. It was amazing and beautiful. Story 20. I'm going to have to speak for my dad here. He passed a few years back. I wrote this out a while back, actually, but maybe this will be a relevant place for it as well. Dad was fearful in his last days. He had been to the hospital many times, and every single time he came close to death. What he remembered didn't reconcile with what most people report when having a near-death experience. He, in fact, did have a lot of bad experiences. One in particular where he relived a day 3 times in a row where doctors sedated him, but he was still fully aware of what was happening to him. He could hear the conversations, feel the pain, feel the choking and suffocation. When I saw him the next day, he had tears in his eyes as he tried to communicate a question on how many days he was out. When I told him 1 day, he was confused. Took him a while to wrap his head around it. He thought he went to hell and this was his eternal punishment. He pondered for a long time on what he could have done to deserve that as a punishment. He did not ever want to be in the hospital. He hated them his whole life, and that experience didn't help. Dad's last trip via ambulance, he actually walked out to the ambulance, and it wasn't because of the usual shortness of breath, it was because of chest pains. I was sure this was going to be a short stay, and he would be back soon. During his last stay, he experienced more sedation, more hallucinations, and more disorientation. I went to visit him every single day to get an update on his status. One night in particular, they had trouble getting his heart rate down. It was steadily beating at about 160 and would calm to 120 or so before going back up. It wasn't good for him. Then the next time he was up, I walked in right around his dinner time. He couldn't wait to talk to me, but he could barely talk. It took all of his effort and energy, but he had some things to say. Son, I know without a doubt that there's an afterlife. Really? My dad nods. How are you so sure? You've been seeing guns on the ceiling and all kinds of hallucinations. That wasn't me. I wasn't here. You weren't here? I was there. Okay, well, did you see anyone you knew? My dad shakes his head. No, it's not like that. You can see souls being born into life, and it's the most beautiful thing you can see. Everyone has their own color, and they're trying to get to white. Trying to get to white. My dad nods again. Yes, time doesn't exist there. Time is here because of us, and we're here because of time. Oh, I should have done more. He looks at his hands. I could have been another Jimmy Page. He's referring to his skill as a guitarist. But you were the greatest dad, and he smirks a little to indicate that isn't what he meant. Do more. Do everything you can. So, like, carpe diem? Like, seize the day? My dad brightens up a bit. Yes, do everything you can. Don't worry about the consequences. Everyone finds their way. People worry too much about the consequences. Just do good and do as much as you can. Everyone eventually gets there. Tell the family. Can I tell everyone? Yes, tell everyone. Okay, I'll tell everybody. My dad nods in agreement. I can tell he's tired at this point. I love you, Dad. I love you too, son. This was the last conversation that I had with him. I miss him terribly and have been trying real hard to find myself again after his passing. It's been a long time, and I've been able to cope with it enough to finally write this all out. I hope that this finds someone that needs to hear it. With love. I hope it wasn't weird that there was kind of a character type voice in this. I didn't really know how else to do it because saying dad before every line and me before every line, it just seems like a lot and even worse for the story. So I hope I was able to convey OP's very touching moment with his father at least half as well as I hope. Thank you, OP, for sharing this. Story 22. I don't share it much, but I've had 4 heart surgeries, and in my first and third one I coded. You had to be conscious for these surgeries to get your heart to react appropriately. The first time it was just nothingness. Black. Just nothing. I can't even explain how long it felt like nothingness. And then I remember waking up with them over me saying, "We lost you for a second there, are you okay?" The second time is the hard one to share. I woke up in a type of subway feeling thing, but everything was white. The subway, the tunnel walls we were speeding through, I didn't have a body per se. It felt like I was the subway at times. And at times it was like I was just looking out a window at the tunnel wall. It came to a stop and it was just black nothingness again. And then I heard the voice of a much older man. He said, "Are you ready to go?" And I just had nothing, like I didn't know how to speak. "We're going now, if you're ready." And something inside me felt so ready to go, like I was a magnet to it. This unknown destination in the black nothingness ahead. I remember finally saying, okay. He said this time with a slightly different tone, "We'll be leaving here. You are ready to go." And finally something in me snapped. I remembered I had a life and people I would leave behind, and my first thought was, I can't leave my girlfriend. I couldn't do that. And my mom and dad, my puppies, I couldn't leave any of them. My family, my friends. And I made a decision I couldn't leave. I didn't even have to say it. Once I decided I couldn't leave and I was for sure staying, I woke up, came to consciousness with the medical team all around me. Story 23. I don't know if this counts as I don't think I flatlined, but I had a huge postpartum hemorrhage after my second and last child was born. I lost 2.3 liters of blood, which I think is about half of it, and considered the highest classification of blood loss before death occurs. I was given general anesthetic before I passed out on my own, but leading up to that was such a surreal experience. As someone has previously mentioned, there is this sense of acceptance, of laying back and going with it. When I first started bleeding, I was scared and panicking. By the time I was being wheeled into theater, I was smiling at the midwife and telling her it was going to be okay. I was delirious and euphoric and not scared at all. My vision started to go. At first it was colored spots and then everything had a gray hue. And that was when tunnel vision set in. Sound became muffled, like putting my hands over my ears. The whole time the general feeling of indifference and no urge to fight it was there. It was so calm, I don't think I've ever computed just how lucky I am to be here. So a near-death experience by blood loss can confirm, not bad. The recovery, though, I felt like crap for freaking weeks and had PTSD. I was so physically weak I could barely take care of the baby and had to inject myself with anti-clotting meds for 6 weeks every day. Story 24. Not me, but right before my great-grandma passed, she kept trying to explain these vivid colors and smells. She kept saying how beautiful things were, and she was saying it's unlike anything she's ever seen. She was an extremely religious woman. A little while after the colors and smells, she told us, he said we have to say it's okay to let her go. I mean, my whole family was standing around saying goodbye. I vividly remember this, even though I was only 9. Once we all said it was okay, she passed on. Also, the night before, she was talking to herself. We asked her what's going on. She pointed at the chair across the room and said, "Please don't be rude. I'm having a conversation with her." And we were confused and asked about what. And she said the woman was explaining what we were going to do with our futures. So strange, and I'll never know if it was real or what was happening, but it's kind of cool to think it's real. Story 25. This is my mother's story. I was privileged to be there when she talked to her doctor the next day and to witness his reaction. She had been afraid to die. After this experience, she was no longer afraid and started enjoying life more, seizing the day, if you will. My mother was in the hospital being treated for a reaction to arthritis medication. This was more than 30 years ago, so procedures have changed. She was in a bed far from the nurse's station because she was stable and in no danger. For some reason, her heart stopped. They never found out why. The nurse found her without a pulse and called a code. My mother, meanwhile, had left her body and was floating up by the ceiling. She said she felt no fear, only wonder at what was happening, and pity for the poor body laying on the bed because it was so sick and damaged. She had a lot wrong with her. As the team was working on her without success and the attending physician went down the hall to the nurse's desk, my mom was curious about what he was going to say, so she followed him and listened to him. He was upset and basically saying he had no idea why her heart stopped, why it wasn't starting again, and to call her personal doctor. He returned to her room and she followed him back. They were working away and she said she found that she had no feeling of fear or regret. She's been physically disabled for some time and was enjoying the freedom of movement and lack of pain. She said she saw the light, but wasn't hugely bright and more of a feeling of peace and safety, and she felt that her parents were near, but mom being mom was more interested in what was happening to her and her body. I mean, if you're dead, it'd be good to know why. The attending physician finally did something that worked to start her heart, and she said she was sucked back in. Oh, she was really mad because she knew she was about to start a wonderful adventure and the doctors spoiled it. She said she didn't want to be in that fat, handicapped body. She struggled to get back out but was held back, and then the drugs they gave her worked and she became unconscious. My sister and I were sitting with her the next day. She was in a lot of pain from them pounding on her chest and pretty ticked off that she didn't get to go on her adventure. Hobbit jokes were ensuing when the attending physician came in to check on her. She asked him why they didn't know what happened and why she died. He didn't know what to say. She told him she'd left her body and had seen what happened. He patronized her and started to tell her about hallucinating and her brain being deprived of oxygen. She shut him up and demanded to know how she could have known what he said at the nurse's station at the end of the hall if she hadn't been there. She proceeded to repeat his conversation with the nurse. The doctor looked like he had seen a ghost. His face went white and he spun on his heel and bolted for the door. He actually bounced off both sides of the door before he was able to get out. That's how fast he was going. She said later she never saw him again. My mother was never religious and hey, didn't start now. Instead, she became more spiritual, something she previously had no interest in. She just felt more at peace with herself and her condition, and started to pay more attention to the little things that people ignore in their rush, like sunsets and butterflies. She was buying all kinds of things, typical of people who don't want to admit that they're very ill. It's a way of staying connected with life. She stopped this behavior and said she didn't need things where she was going. That was always said with a smile. She asked that I share her story so that people know there really is something after death. It's interesting and not scary at all. It has nothing to do with religion. What happens afterwards just seemed to be like a fact, like gravity. She said that she was surprised that she wasn't surprised. She died for real about a year later, and I'm sure since she had an inquisitive mind that she's enjoying herself. On a slightly different note, I've had several dogs who returned after they passed. The only ones who came back had huge personalities and felt real ownership of the house. The best story is about Joe, a little black dachshund/beagle who ruled the house for 10 years. The night after she passed, my ex heard her at the door. There was no mistaking her scratch and bark. I heard her too, as did the other dogs. He didn't believe in ghosts, but opened the door and called out to her. Honey, our Doberman, was lounging in Joe's chair, and she got out of it like she was shot. The other two dogs milled around as if they were greeting someone. I couldn't see her, but I talked to her as if she were there, and I explained what had happened and that it was time she go on over the Rainbow Bridge. I would join her when I could. The next morning when I came downstairs, Honey was in Joe's chair, and made it clear that it was now hers. I think Joe gave it to her. She always was a beneficent queen. Story 26. So this is secondhand from my dad, but he was always a little shaken up when he told this story. Years before I came along, my dad was cruising around on his motorcycle when a little dog ran into the road straight at him barking. He swerved so he wouldn't hit the poor pup, and a car in opposing traffic did as well. My dad got clipped and thrown off his bike. It was on a hill, so he slid pretty far until his body hit a parked car. Now, the weird part, he always got this sort of haunted look when he talked about it, which wasn't often. He says he remembers plain as day standing at the bottom of the street on the corner, watching as a man got hit off his bike and tumbled through the air and down the hill. He says he remembers thinking, "That guy is definitely dead." He woke up the next day in the hospital with a nurse picking gravel out of his back. He had reconstruction surgery on his hand and arm, which consists mostly of metal pins now. Remember, kids, if on a motorcycle, always wear your leather and helmets. Without them, my dad would have died, and I wouldn't be around. Story 27. When I was a really young kid, I had a serious case of epiglottitis, which left me clinically dead for a moment. It felt like a dream where I was in the sky, kind of like an angel/Cupid looking down at myself in the hospital, with doctors and nurses surrounding me, and my mother crying. I didn't seem to care very much, but I remember thinking that I want to go back. I was very young, maybe 3, but I still remember this quite vividly. It seemed like an out-of-body experience. For sure, this was influenced by the fact that my parents are Catholic and I enjoyed looking at cupids in paintings, because they looked a bit like me when I was young. At least, that's what I tell myself. Story 28. There are some researchers who have been collecting and quantifying the data of near-death experiences, NDEs, for years now. They have created 6 categories/stages of NDEs that generally sum up most experiences. The hellish experience. It can either be a mildly uncomfortable experience, a cold, dark, damp, loveless experience, or the traditional flames and devil experience. Sometimes they say they're drawn out of this realm by an indescribable love. Very few people recount experiencing this. There's another type of experience where one has an out-of-body perspective and can travel freely. Oftentimes this happens in an operation room, where one's heart has stopped and the doctors are working to revive the patient. The individual may be able to go to other rooms in the hospital or travel across the country. If they remain in the hospital room, they do not always recognize their own bodies on the table and can feel confused. Quick note, there's been a surge in NDEs since the 60s, when resuscitation techniques became more advanced. Much like many of the other Redditors' comments, there's an experience of blissful, warm darkness that just feels comfortable. It is an indescribable nothingness, often without memory or any inkling of consciousness at all. The next experience is similar to the last, but with an additional light that is usually further away, emanating warmth and love and forgiveness. The individual is either attracted to this light and goes toward it, or the light itself comes to the person. It allegedly gets better and better the closer one draws to the light, and so they continue. Obviously, this is where the phrase, "don't go to the light," comes from. This experience continues where the last one leaves off. where the person has broken through the light. They're now experiencing a love/compassion/forgiveness/state of consciousness that is unlike anything they can put into words. Sometimes they encounter a sort of guide. This could be a loving anonymous being or a religious figure. If they experience this, it is sometimes linked to their beliefs on Earth, but not always. This experience is sometimes accompanied by the most beautiful music. This being may present them to loved ones or show them a life review. This is a very common experience of those who have had NDEs. It is at this point where the NDEer decides or is told to return to their body. There is sometimes a choice, often because they have work left to accomplish in their lives. The final experience goes beyond the previous state of love and consciousness, and is experienced only by a relatively few people compared to the previous others. They say that they experience a becoming one with the universe/universal energy that unites everything/God. They have stated that they understand everything, that knowledge is known just by thinking of a topic. Disclaimer: people have different words to describe all these experiences, but what they typically agree on is that words themselves cannot come close to explaining their encounter for all of the aforementioned NDEs. Most experiences are overwhelmingly pleasant. They lose fear of death and they cannot wait to return to this state. However, they know they must wait. NDEs that I've looked into pretty much all fall into these categories. I want to end this by saying that if you wind up researching NDEs, come to your own conclusions about them. Is there a reason for someone to be pushing a certain belief on you? I have confidence that what people say about their NDEs, they themselves wholly believe to be true. Whether or not you do is up to your own judgment. There are people who make videos and give talks about NDEs they supposedly experience, but to me, some seem to be fake and over-rehearsed. Take what you want from my spiel. Yeah, as I was going through this thread, I was just thinking, there have got to be people who have studied this their whole lives because it is just so insanely interesting, and well, there you go. It makes sense though, right? It's sort of a magical experience that's varied between people, but that everyone will inevitably face at some point, so why wouldn't you want to know more about it? And hey, that's why we're all here, isn't it? Story 29. My grandmother, when she was a kid, was walking her dog when she got hit by a car. She and her dog hit a fire hydrant, and at that instant she rose up from the city block she was at with her dog. The dog survived. She reached the top of somewhere and a voice told her, "Look at your mother. You can't go, and you have a lot to do." So she came to in the hospital and tried to close her eyes and go back, and she was crying because it was just so peaceful. Story 30. This happened to me Tuesday morning, actually. Was going through a lot of money issues and thought I was going to lose everything. I hung myself in the closet. Fiancé found me, cut me down, and called 911. I was blue, dead in her arms, and I'd peed my pants. Tongue is still swollen. I have no idea how that happened. The EMTs brought me back. I was dead, and they brought me back. I'm still at the hospital now and don't see me leaving anytime soon. Anyway, I saw nothing. Just darkness. No sounds, no white light, nothing. Just black. Next thing I know, I woke up in an ambulance. Taking your own life sucks, guys. Don't even try it. People love you. Story 31. I had a clinical chief, senior surgeon, during training always ask the same question after heroic resuscitation that involved open heart massage to regain a beat in the trauma bay, aka a left lateral thoracotomy. Hospitals were different then. Large wards with 6 patients that we would round on, with medical students, residents, fellows, and attending. Maybe 20 people. So he would ask, "Do you remember anything?" And the gangbangers would inevitably say it was a scary experience and they were frightened by demons or some nightmare scenario. And the victim of a random act of violence like a stabbing during a mugging would say, "I saw a white light. It wasn't scary." Or, "It was beautiful." I'm not particularly religious and reasoned this away as the mental state of the victim, but it would give me chills to hear some of the answers. Story 32. Coded after attempting to take my own life. My son had passed away 3 years before, and I remember going to a place without time and watching him grow up, without the neonatal Marfan syndrome and hydrocephalus that took his life. I should point out that I lost consciousness before the code was called, so I don't remember rising out of my body. I do remember slamming back into it after being shocked, though. That was no fun. My life changed completely afterwards. I left my wife, who wasn't helping me in my own struggles with Marfan syndrome, got the guts to come out as trans, and found a great woman who supports me and is totally in love with me. I don't worry about anything but love and taking care of the people around me. Life is too short for anything else, A visit with my son sorted it all out. Story 33. I have 2 stories. When I was 9, I used to have fainting spells. One time, I fell down the stairs and lost consciousness. My mom said I went stiff as a board. I remember, as if floating near the ceiling, watching my mom run to the phone and calling 911. I could see my dad start to do CPR on me. Then I looked behind me, saw a bright light, and heard a voice say, "It's not your time." Then I went back into my body as I heard my dad yell, "Come on, damn it." I was really scared when I came to, and it took me a while, like years, to figure out what I had experienced. I can't explain what happened. I felt calm, though, while I was out. I don't know if I was really dead or just unconscious, and my mind made it all up. The other story I have, I know, was real. 6 years ago, my brother died from adrenal cancer. His wife and I slept in his hospital room that night. His friends and the 2 of us sat around his bed as he lay unconscious and told stories about my brother and laughed about all the great times we had with him. At 3 a.m., I woke from a dream I was having of seeing him walking down a large tunnel that had a bright light at the end of it. He was healthy looking again, and he turned around to look at me, smiled and waved, and then walked into the light. When I woke up, I rolled over to look at him, and he'd stopped breathing. I touched him, and he was still warm, and his skin was still soft, as if he had just passed away a moment before. It was like he hung on until he knew we would be okay, and then waited to pass until we were sleeping so we didn't have to watch him. I loved my brother. He was my best friend, my biggest champion, and he encouraged me and built me up when I had no confidence in myself. God, I miss him, but I'm relieved that he's not in pain and suffering anymore. Story 34. I remember medics banging on my chest telling me not to give up. I remember hearing everything everyone was saying. I even remembered thinking, dude, stop hitting my chest. I remember being put in the ambulance and being in the emergency room. When I told my mom later that I heard all of them and remember everything, she told me there was no way I could have because I was completely unresponsive when they found me. It definitely had a profound effect on me. It's made me actually more afraid of death because I personally believe your brain lives long after your body stops, which is extremely terrifying. Story 35. I wasn't dead, but I was dying. I passed out on the floor on my back and puked while on the ground. I remember being surrounded by nothingness, and then all of a sudden this loud, terrible static that overwhelmed me completely. Everything started beating, and in retrospect, this was my heartbeat. Suddenly, the static and noise began fading inwards until it became a small speck, and I felt air rushing into me. My vision came back, and an EMT was bagging me. I felt terribly weak and groggy, but all there. All in all, terrible experience. I think it was me coming back to life. I don't know. Story 36. These descriptions are disturbing me because I've had something similar. I became very ill and was at the airport for a flight. I was having extreme body aches and coughing fairly violently. I decided I was too sick to fly and went to a hotel to get some rest. At that time, I was very against going to the hospital, and I believed I could tough it out. Anyway, all night I feel terrible and get no sleep at all until I suddenly pass out. My body felt extremely heavy. I wasn't moving, but it felt like every cell was 1,000 pounds. After a few seconds, I feel a wave of what I can remember being physically light wash over me. I was lighter than air and suddenly over my body. I somehow knew I could leave it if I wanted to, but didn't. I remember feeling like I didn't want to leave yet. I don't remember how I got back in my body, but I do remember that when I woke up, I was the most refreshed I'd been in a long time, and suddenly, not sick at all. Story 37. I wasn't the one who experienced this, but it was one of my teachers I had in high school a few years ago. She was having open heart surgery in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She coded 3 times during the surgery. When she came out of surgery and began to regain consciousness, she kept speaking of all these souls that she saw. I remember her saying she was scared for them and wasn't sure what would happen to them. I can't remember exactly what she said about the souls, but I do remember her saying that they had all just died in an accident. Her surgery was on August 1st, 2007, the same day that the I-35W bridge collapsed in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It collapsed while she was being operated on. Story 38. When I was 15, I was dead for a short while during an ambulance ride. I have no idea how long it was, to be honest. My therapist after suggested I find out the details to know how close I came to permanent death, but that's too much for me. Anyway, on to the experience. I was in so much pain and anxiety leading up to it. You have no idea. I wanted it to end. And then everything faded away. First to black, and then to something I can only describe as seeing and feeling existence itself. I don't even know how to describe this. It's the only way I can describe what it was because it was so beyond normal perception. Mind you, I'm not a religious person, so that was definitely strange. All my pain was gone and I felt great. like I was getting a warm hug from the universe and everything was truly awesome. Coming back was fairly sudden. First hearing voices and then a fading back into where I was. This was definitely the most unpleasant. The closest thing I can compare the fading in / out to visually would be when a movie does a slow fade between scenes, and the feeling is similar to laying down in bed. That last second before you fall asleep and you are totally relaxed and not thinking, just experiencing your being. All this said, I fear death more than anything else. Like, yes, it was pleasant, but I never want to have that experience again. I'm actually on the verge of tears just thinking about it right now. Maybe it's my atheism showing, but death as a permanent thing just terrifies me. So, there's my story. Make of it what you will. Story 40. I overdosed twice. I've been clean for 6 years now. The first time I felt nothing at first. I just remember falling down. I was by myself in my room and my brother was in the living room. He had no idea. I couldn't really move and I tried to text my mom, who luckily was on her way home from work. Text didn't make sense, so the first thing she did when she got home was find me. I don't remember, but the next thing I do remember is feeling like lava was being injected into my brain, and like I just wanted to get up and go. No life flashing before my eyes, nothing like that, just lava in the brain. The second time I had no idea it even happened, but my best friend saved my life. I know it's kind of morbid, but that's definitely the way I'd be down to go out. It was just like I fell asleep. I'm glad I didn't die, though. I never thought things could get as good as they are if I just used my head and did what I knew I was supposed to. Got help, got clean, and I'm getting married. Story 42. Long story short, I had a bad reaction to a bunch of medication after a C-section and died for a short period of time. I never got to hold my son. I remember hearing people talking calmly, but sternly, and a lot of beeping. Then it was quite a bit like others described. Calm, black, and then just nothing. I heard someone, probably a nurse, say that it was time to be a mommy and meet my boy. I faded in and out until I eventually woke up, and it sounds cheesy, but if it wasn't for my son, I probably would have never come back. Story 43. Not me, but my mom. She had gotten an ulcer back in 2008. When she got to the hospital, she said there was a male doctor that told her she needed surgery immediately or she would die. She said that during this time, she was fighting and thrashing and screaming because my father had just abandoned us, and she was desperately trying to get back to us. She said the male doctor told her everything was going to be okay, that we were safe and sound. After her experience, she checked out of the hospital and a couple weeks later turned up at the same hospital with a cake and a card, hoping to find the doctor that took care of her. When she got there, she described him, and the woman at the help desk was confused. There was no male doctor in that day or any day. The entire staff were women. The said man never even worked there. A lot of time has passed, but I always like to think an angel watched over my mom that night and helped her get back to my family. Story 44. Not me, but my late grandfather was clinically dead in the hospital's ICU after surgery many years ago, around 1990. I don't remember what surgery he had, but he was in his 80s, and had a host of illnesses at that point. Diabetes, and he broke his hip, etc. This particular night in the ICU, he coded. They brought him back, and when he woke up, he asked a nurse, "How is the little boy doing?" She said, "What little boy?" "The little black boy with the gunshot wounds. How is he?" The nurse replied, "Oh, he's going to be okay." He asked other questions about patients who had been brought to the ER at the same time he was clinically dead, and on a different floor of the hospital. They asked how he knew about those ER patients, and he said he was floating and saw them. He saw them working on himself, and floated to the ER and saw those patients. There were multiple witnesses / hospital employees at the time to corroborate this. I remember being silently amazed at their lack of astonishment to his experience. Seems like this wasn't the first time this has happened. How are you not amazed by something like that? I would be astonished every single time, because I feel like the cycle would be like, I hear about it, and then I reason it away with something, and then it happens again, I'm like, and then I reason it away, and then maybe that's just me. Story 45. My dad clinically died for over a minute as a result of an iodine drip during a procedure, despite a documented severe iodine allergy. He described it as an out-of-body experience in which there was complete silence, and he was the spectator in the upper corner of the room, watching the staff scramble to revive him. He said he had no concept of time or of the panic below. He just observed in total peace. He saw one nurse finally notice his bracelet and alert everyone of what the issue was. They cut the drip and continued their efforts to revive him. During this time, even though he was watching the end of his life, he felt an extreme peace, and he was pain-free for the first time in years. He was aware that he was dying, and he was ready and content. Everything got bright, and he started to float upwards, until he saw a man who he didn't recognize who told him it wasn't his time yet. All at once he was jolted back into his body and came to. Once stable, he described what he witnessed, and even thanked the particular nurse who noticed his allergy alert bracelet. They were all baffled that he knew the detail. I can only hope that when he did pass away 4 years ago, it was an even more peaceful experience than this. It gives me peace knowing death was something that he'd faced already, so he wasn't scared when it came again. Story 46. I was hit by a car while riding a bicycle without a helmet when I was 17. I suffered a traumatic brain injury, including a brain bleed, which led to a condition called status epilepticus. Not dead, but close. My heart worked, but I was without oxygen for a long time. I woke up in the hospital nearly 2 weeks later in severe pain. I had one hell of a headache. I had a weird recollection of a dreamlike state where I dreamed an 8-bit, kind of like Mario, except it was a field of flowers and a bunny rabbit. It was quiet. I felt nothing. I was riding my bike 1 minute and completely gone the next. It was a traumatic event I still have issues with nearly 15 years later. Story 47. I nearly drowned in the ocean as a kid. A lifeguard on his very first day of training saw me thrashing from a quarter mile away and was able to get to me after I'd filled my lungs with salt water and sank. I do remember him gripping my arm before completely blacking out. Drowning, by the way, very comfy way to go. After the struggle and convulsive intake of water, there's a warm serenity. With my heart and lungs stopped, I was pronounced dead on the beach by trained lifeguards, but they kept up CPR until the paramedics came and shocked me back to life. To this day, I remember everything, both physically and mentally. Way clearer than any other childhood memory, but the period I was pronounced to be dead was a black hole of non-conscious nothingness. Story 48. My last semester at a certain college, I was assaulted by a football player for walking where he was trying to drive. Note, he was 325 pounds and I was 120. While unconscious on the ground, I lived a different life. I met a wonderful young lady. She made my heart skip and my face red. I pursued her for months and dispatched a few jerk boyfriends before I finally won her over. After 2 years, we got married, and almost immediately she bore me a daughter. I had a great job, and my wife didn't have to work outside of the house. When my daughter was 2, she, my wife, bore me a son. My son was the joy of my life. I would walk in his room every morning before I left for work and doted on him and my daughter. One day, while sitting on the couch, I noticed that the perspective of the lamp was odd, like inverted. It was still in 3D, but just wrong. I was transfixed. I couldn't look away from it. I stayed up all night staring at it. The next morning, I didn't go to work. Something was just not right about that lamp. I stopped eating. I left the couch only to use the bathroom at first, and soon I stopped that too, as I wasn't eating or drinking. I stared at the lamp for 3 days before my wife got really worried. She had someone come and try to talk to me, but by this time my cognizance was breaking up and my wife was freaking out. She took the kids to her mother's house just before I had my epiphany. The lamp is not real. The house wasn't real. My wife, my kids, none of this was real. The lamp started to grow wider and deeper. It was still inverted dimensions. It took up my entire perspective and all I could see was red. I heard voices, screams, all kinds of weird noises, and I became aware of pain. A lot of pain. The first words I said were, "I'm missing teeth," and opened my eyes. I was laying on my back on the sidewalk surrounded by people I didn't know. Lots were freaking out. I was completely confused. At some point, a cop scooped me up, dragged/walked me across the sidewalk and grass, and threw me face down in the back of a cop car. I was still confused. I was taken to the hospital by the cop. Seems he didn't want to wait for the ambulance to arrive, and given CT scans and crap. I went through about 3 years of horrid depression. I was grieving the loss of my wife and children and dealing with the knowledge that they never existed. I was scared that I was going insane, as I would cry myself to sleep hoping I would see her in my dreams. I never have, but sometimes I see my son, usually just a glimpse out of my peripheral vision. He's perpetually 5 years old, and I can never hear what he says. I feel like I've seen some media with this in it. And I'm not saying OP is necessarily lying about their experience, but it's something that I've thought about too. It's like, this entire life, everything I'm doing, me talking to a microphone right now for you guys, I could just wake up the next day and none of it was real. That is entirely possible, albeit completely improbable. And yeah, it is a horrifying thought. I can't even begin to imagine how horrifying it would be to experience it. Story 49. I'm not sure if I was clinically dead or not, but I drowned in the ocean 4 years ago, saving 2 children who'd been swept out to sea by a freak landslip and subsequent strong current. I don't really remember my last action before drowning, but the lifeboat crew said they saw me, and before going under I threw the children to them. They said the only explanation is a rush of adrenaline at the sight of them arriving, knowing that help had arrived, as there should have been no way I could have thrown 2 kids in that situation. To be perfectly honest, I had given up hope. as I felt my energy sapping trying to keep the children above water as all three of us were clothed, and I felt the lactic acid building up, and try as I might, I couldn't move my limbs anymore. I was just telling the children it was going to be okay, knowing full well I was about to run out of steam at any moment. The relief of getting to them was swiftly replaced by dread, as I realized how far we were from the beach, and the terrifying realization of how fatigued I was set in, thinking there was no way we were going to survive. After I threw both children to the crew who had arrived at speed with rescue gear, they said I went under. Only by sheer luck did they manage to pull me out of the water too and revive me. I remember clearly not being able to see when I went under the waves and beneath the ocean, and as I started to breathe in the water. Instead of fear, I felt strong sadness, not knowing if I had done enough to save them. A couple of gulps later, I must have gone unconscious, as the next thing I remember is being revived by CPR, apparently, and coming round. It was very confusing, and I haven't really talked about it until now. But the one thing that is deeply strange to me is that there was no fear at that point of drowning, only calm and the wish that I knew the children had made it and they were safe. The children are now 11 and 8 and living happy lives, thank goodness. It could have been so very different, and I don't take life for granted, that's for sure. Story 51. I don't know if this counts, but I had surgery on my hip back in February of '09. I'd been in a car accident. When I was coming out of surgery, it was discovered that I'd been slightly overdosed on anesthetic. Never found out by how much, though. Instead of the typical amount of time spent in recovery, I think I spent a solid 2.5 hours in the recovery room. I kept falling asleep and ceasing to breathe every 30 to 60 seconds for over an hour. Every time I faded out, everything simply went black. I felt nothing, I saw nothing, but there was no fear and no pain. I do remember feeling incredibly calm, and like I was being torn between two completely different dimensions every time I alternated between consciousness and slipping away. Interestingly, it was my mother yelling at me to breathe every time I faded out that kept me waking back up. It was a really strange experience. I don't know if I was clinically dead because it was for such short periods of time, but it definitely made me less afraid of dying. I'm sure this will sound insane to some, but I'm pretty convinced there's a lot we don't know about the universe, and I believe that our consciousnesses are part of it. I believe quite firmly that when we die, we don't cease to exist, because we've always been here, and will always be here, just like everything that is, just in a different form. Like how at one point everything that exists now was a simple collection of hydrogen atoms. The universe just had to take a lot of time to develop what would become consciousness, and bodies to house it. But bodies don't last forever, and we should all feel incredibly lucky to have been given the chance to be part of an existence that was alive and self-aware. I know I do. Story 52. I recall very clearly the experience of being pulled through a tunnel of sorts at increasing speed until I could no longer bear it. When that finally stopped, I was in a cave system with smoky shadows and maybe 6 tunnels leading all different directions. There were intermittent voices coming from each, and they seemed to compete with each other. First came echoes of old, mostly forgotten but familiar voices, and others were unfamiliar and dark but seductive. After what seemed like an age, I decided to follow the one tunnel from which no voices came. As I moved forward, the voices from the other tunnels I had left behind seemed to become louder, insisting me to turn back. But I kept on going. Finally, I found a cave opening into a garden courtyard, where an old priestly man sat waiting. I did not recognize him, but he explained that I should. "We've known each other for so long," he said. I'm not reading the rest of that story because I had a feeling it was going somewhere, and it's a rickroll. But by cutting it off there, maybe you can have some suspension of disbelief and just, I don't know, pretend that OP did not just horrendously troll all of us. Story 53. My mother died 3 times during a year-long hospital stay in the mid-60s. She was hit by a drunk driver. The shortest time was 7 minutes and the longest was 12. Docs told my grandmother to make funeral arrangements, that she wouldn't be going home. She was 18. During her 12-minute death, she felt euphoria and was aware of people around her, but says some people she was aware of were people who had died before her, like her father. Story 54. I had a moment at the dentist. It was an extremely difficult extraction. I was out for a long time, and there came a moment where I could hear everything, but I couldn't see. My mouth was pouring blood, and I could feel it pooling in my mouth. Felt like I wasn't in my body, though. I remember there was a moment when I didn't feel in my body, and the blood kept pooling, and all I could think was, if you don't get out of this, you won't ever. This is how things happen and people die. You have to come back down now, or it's not ever gonna happen. I had to fight to get myself back in my body. It was so weird and scary. I came to and everybody that works there was in the room. It was the scariest thing I've ever been through. And that is the final story for today. I hope this thread satisfied your, in the most literal sense possible, morbid curiosity. This is a topic I personally find really interesting too. It's a cool intersectionality of spirituality and psychology and physiology and medicine. And I think out of all of the ones here, the ones where it's an out-of-body experience and they can go around the hospital and see other people and talk about them when they're awake, that freaks me out the most. And by freaks me out, I think I mostly mean it's cool. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. For now, I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.